They said a mafia boss never looked twice at anyone who worked for him, but no one could explain why one simple question stopped an empire in its tracks. Damian Romano had built his reputation on discipline so absolute that even rival families measured their words before speaking his name. At 34, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders, intricate tattoos stretching across his hands, neck, and the edge of his jaw, his tailored black suit unable to hide the powerful frame that had become almost mythical throughout New York's underworld. Every meeting he attended followed the same silent rhythm. Powerful men negotiated. Security watched every doorway. Advisors listened for weakness. Damian remained unreadable. Nothing surprised him anymore. At least that was what everyone believed until the annual Romano Foundation Gala transformed the city's most elegant ballroom into the center of attention. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors while politicians, business executives, judges, celebrities, and respected community leaders exchanged carefully rehearsed smiles. Hidden beneath the glamour, influential figures from several powerful organizations quietly evaluated one another, understanding that every conversation carried consequences beyond the room. Damian stood near the grand staircase, discussing an upcoming business expansion with 3 trusted associates, his voice calm, measured, almost detached. He heard every glass placed on a table, every whispered opinion, every nervous laugh from across the ballroom. Years of surviving impossible situations had sharpened his instincts beyond ordinary perception. Then the entrance doors opened again. Emily Carter stepped inside, holding a small gift bag, and immediately wished she could disappear. 26 years old, curvy, cheerful, endlessly optimistic, and spectacularly awkward whenever too many people looked at her, she had never intended to become the center of attention. Earlier that afternoon, she had accidentally spilled an entire cup of coffee across the navy business suit she always wore to formal events. With only minutes before the gala, she had reluctantly accepted the only clean dress available in her apartment, one her older sister insisted she keep for emergencies. It fit well, looked elegant, and made Emily self-conscious with every step. She quietly muttered to herself that Mr. Romano probably would not even notice she was wearing something different. She was wrong. The moment she entered, conversation slowed almost imperceptibly. Several guests glanced toward the unfamiliar silhouette before returning to their conversations. Emily smiled politely, nearly tripped over the edge of the entrance rug, caught herself with an embarrassed laugh, and whispered a soft apology to absolutely no one in particular. A nearby waiter smiled despite himself. Even one of Damian's veteran security officers fought to hide an amused grin. Emily adjusted a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, took one careful breath, and started walking toward the registration table, completely unaware that dozens of experienced observers had already noticed her arrival. Damian stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. His associates exchanged puzzled glances because their boss never paused without reason. His eyes remained fixed across the ballroom, following Emily as she nervously balanced the gift bag, almost bumped into an oversized floral arrangement, recovered with another shy smile, and thanked an elderly guest for moving aside, even though she had been the one who wandered into his path. Something unfamiliar tightened inside Damian's chest. It was not anger. It was not concern. It was something he refused to identify. Emily finally reached the registration desk and signed her name, believing the awkward moment had passed. She turned, searching for her employer with an innocent smile, only to find Damian already standing several feet away, his expression calm but impossible to read. The ballroom seemed quieter than before. Without raising his voice, without breaking eye contact, he asked the single question that would quietly change both of their lives. "Who told you to wear that dress?" Emily Carter felt every pair of eyes in the ballroom settle on her, and for one terrifying second, she wondered if she had somehow forgotten to wear her employee badge instead of realizing everyone was staring at the dress. Damian's quiet question lingered between them, neither harsh nor gentle, simply impossible to ignore. She blinked twice before pointing awkwardly at herself. Me? She asked with complete sincerity, instantly realizing how ridiculous that sounded. A faint cough escaped one of the attorneys standing nearby, while another guest quickly looked away to hide an amused smile. Emily's cheeks turned bright pink. "Of course you mean me," she whispered, covering her face for half a second. "That was not my smartest moment." Damien continued watching her without changing expression. Anyone else would have interpreted his silence as disappointment, but Emily had worked beside him for almost 3 years and knew his silence usually meant he was thinking much harder than he wanted others to notice. She nervously cleared her throat. "It is actually a very long story, sir." "Then tell me," Damien replied calmly. Emily let out a tiny sigh and glanced around the ballroom. "Right here?" she asked. "Everyone can hear us." Damien nodded once. "Yes." Emily laughed softly despite her embarrassment. "Well, this morning began perfectly normal until I proved once again that coffee is my greatest enemy." Several members of Damien's security team exchanged curious glances as she continued. "I was organizing your meeting schedule while carrying a full mug because I believed I could multitask." She smiled sheepishly. The coffee disagreed. Even Damien's chief advisor lowered his eyes, already expecting the rest of the story. "I tripped over absolutely nothing," Emily admitted. "There was no chair, no rug, no box, just empty floor." She shrugged helplessly. "I still do not understand how I managed it." A quiet chuckle spread through the nearby group before they quickly regained their composure. Emily continued, growing more animated as nervousness gave way to honesty. "The coffee landed directly on my navy suit. Every single drop somehow found the fabric instead of the floor. It was honestly impressive." She lifted both hands dramatically. "If clumsiness were an Olympic event, I would bring home the gold medal." This time, even 2 veteran bodyguards smiled openly. Damien remained silent, but something almost invisible softened around his eyes. Emily looked down at the elegant dress again. "I was about to cancel tonight because I did not have time to buy anything else." She smiled with genuine affection as she remembered the afternoon. "Then my older sister opened my closet, pulled out this dress, handed it to me, and said, 'Emily, it is a charity gala, not a funeral. Or something that makes you smile for once.'" Emily laughed quietly. "I argued for 15 minutes. She won in 15 seconds. She folded her hands together. I honestly believed no one would even notice." One elderly donor passing nearby smiled warmly. "Young lady," he said kindly, "that may have been the most optimistic prediction I have ever heard." Emily covered her mouth, laughing at herself again. "I know. Looking back, it was not my strongest prediction." The atmosphere surrounding them became unexpectedly lighter. Powerful executives who had spent the evening discussing contracts worth millions of dollars suddenly found themselves listening to a secretary casually confessing defeat in a battle against a cup of coffee. It was refreshingly ordinary inside an extraordinary room. Damien studied Emily with growing confusion, though none of it appeared on his face. She was completely unaware of the effect she had on people. She did not seek attention. She did not measure every sentence for strategic advantage. She simply answered every question with complete honesty, even when honesty made her look wonderfully ridiculous. That innocence felt almost impossible in his world. Emily noticed he had still not responded. Her smile faded slightly. "Sir, if the dress is inappropriate for the event, I can leave. I really do not want to embarrass your organization." She lowered her voice. "I promise I was only trying to make it here on time." Damien looked at her for another long moment before answering. "That is not the problem." Emily tilted her head in confusion. "Then what is—" Emily searched Damien's face for an answer, but his expression revealed nothing beyond the quiet control that had made powerful people fear disappointing him. The silence stretched just long enough for her imagination to invent a dozen terrible explanations. Maybe the dress violated the event's formal guidelines. Maybe she had embarrassed the Romano organization in front of important guests. Maybe she had accidentally worn the same color as someone she was not supposed to match. Her thoughts raced so quickly that she nearly missed his reply. "The problem," Damien said evenly, is that everyone has stopped paying attention to the charity event. Emily frowned before slowly turning around. Only then did she realize what he meant. Conversations that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier had become noticeably quieter. More than one guest glanced in her direction before pretending to admire the decorations. A photographer who had originally been taking pictures near the entrance discreetly shifted his camera toward the center of the room. Emily immediately looked back at Damien with wide eyes. "Oh no," she whispered the words as if saying them more softly might somehow make the situation disappear. "They're looking at me." Damien did not answer because there was nothing to deny. Emily instinctively took half a step backward and nearly bumped into a passing server carrying sparkling water. She gasped, apologized 3 times in less than 5 seconds, reached out to steady the tray, then accidentally picked up an empty glass that did not belong to her. "This is not mine," she announced, placing it back exactly where it had been. The young server blinked before smiling politely. "You are fine, Miss Carter." Emily smiled with visible relief. "Thank you for being so understanding. I promise I am usually only slightly less chaotic than this." 2 nearby guests laughed quietly, unable to hide their amusement. Damien watched the entire exchange without interrupting. He had negotiated with presidents, corporate giants, and rival leaders who concealed every emotion behind polished smiles. Emily was the complete opposite. Every thought appeared on her face before she even spoke it aloud. Nothing about her felt calculated. Nothing about her was artificial. She simply existed exactly as she was, and somehow that honesty drew attention more effectively than expensive jewelry or rehearsed confidence. Before Emily could recover completely, another small challenge found her. One of the event coordinators hurried toward her carrying a stack of auction brochures. "Miss Carter," the woman said, "would you mind placing these on the welcome table?" "Of course." Emily accepted the brochures with determination, clearly eager to be useful instead of noticeable. She took 3 careful steps before the top brochure slipped sideways. She caught it. The second slid after it. She caught that one too. Then the entire stack slowly leaned forward like a tower, giving up on gravity. Emily froze. "Do not panic," she whispered to herself. "You have this." She did not have it. The brochures floated gracefully onto the polished floor in every direction. A small child watching nearby clapped enthusiastically as if someone had performed a magic trick. Emily looked at the scattered papers, closed her eyes for one brief second, and sighed with theatrical defeat. Gravity wins again. Instead of frustration, soft laughter rippled across the surrounding guests. Several people immediately bent down to help gather the brochures. An elderly woman handed one back with a warm smile. "You remind me of my granddaughter." Emily accepted it gratefully. "I hope she is a little more coordinated." "Not even close," the woman replied. Damien noticed something unusual as he watched strangers helping Emily without hesitation. In rooms filled with influence and ambition, people rarely paused to assist someone unless they expected something in return. Yet Emily inspired kindness without asking for it. She thanked every person individually, smiled at each of them, and somehow remembered all of their names after hearing them only once. His chief advisor stepped closer and lowered his voice. "She changes the atmosphere wherever she goes." Damien kept his eyes on Emily as she accidentally placed the brochures upside down, laughed at herself, fixed them correctly, and gave an exaggerated nod of satisfaction as though she had completed an impossible mission. For reasons he could not explain, watching her smile felt strangely more important than the carefully negotiated alliances waiting for him inside the ballroom. The orchestra eased into a slower melody as more distinguished guests arrived, and with them came a subtle change in the atmosphere that even Emily could feel. The conversations became more careful. Smiles looked polished instead of genuine. Several members of Damien's security team quietly repositioned themselves without needing instructions. Important people were entering the ballroom. Emily finished arranging the auction brochures, dusted off her hands with exaggerated satisfaction, and whispered to herself, "Nothing else can possibly go wrong tonight." Almost on cue, She turned too quickly and walked straight into a decorative ice sculpture shaped like an eagle. The sculpture remained perfectly intact. Emily, however, stumbled backward with a startled squeak before catching her balance. She stared at the frozen bird for a second and nodded respectfully. "You win." A nearby florist covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Even Damien's chief advisor looked away for a moment, pretending to study the guest list while a smile threatened to appear. Damien noticed something unusual inside himself. Every time Emily embarrassed herself, he expected her confidence to disappear. Instead, she simply laughed, apologized, and continued moving forward as though making mistakes was just another ordinary part of life. That quiet resilience fascinated him more than he cared to admit. Before he could reflect on the feeling any further, the ballroom doors opened once again. Vanessa Moretti entered surrounded by an elegant entourage, her emerald evening gown drawing immediate attention from nearly every guest. She carried herself with effortless confidence, greeting influential donors, judges, executives, and political figures as though the evening had been organized in her honor. Her father, Victor Moretti, followed several steps behind, exchanging measured handshakes with leaders whose names rarely appeared in public headlines. Their arrival shifted the balance of the room, respect mixed with caution wherever they walked. Vanessa spotted Damien almost immediately and smiled with practiced warmth before crossing the marble floor. "Damien," she said gracefully, "you look exactly as composed as ever." Damien acknowledged her with a polite nod. "Vanessa." She glanced toward Emily, who had just accepted another stack of name cards from an event volunteer. Emily was concentrating so hard on not dropping them that she failed to notice Vanessa watching her. Vanessa's smile barely changed, yet something colder settled behind her eyes. "Interesting choice for office staff," she remarked quietly enough that only those standing nearby could hear. Damien did not answer. Vanessa continued, still smiling. "Your secretary certainly knows how to become the center of attention." Emily finally looked up, realizing the conversation concerned her. She offered a friendly smile. "Good evening. It is nice to see you again." Vanessa returned the smile without warmth. "Is it?" Emily blinked, uncertain whether she had misunderstood the tone. "I hope you are enjoying the gala." Vanessa slowly looked Emily up and down before replying. "I expected someone in your position to choose something a little more professional." Emily instinctively looked down at her dress. Her fingers nervously smoothed the fabric, although nothing was out of place. "I did not mean to stand out," she admitted softly. "It was honestly the only formal outfit I had available tonight." Vanessa let out a quiet laugh. Of course it was. The words sounded pleasant enough to anyone listening from a distance, but their meaning landed like tiny cuts hidden beneath velvet. Emily forced a small smile, hoping the uncomfortable exchange would simply end. Instead, Vanessa took one small step closer. "Sometimes," she said with perfect composure, "people forget that elegance is not only about clothing. It is also about knowing where you belong." Emily lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat. The cheerful confidence she had carried throughout the evening dimmed ever so slightly. Damien noticed the change immediately. He also noticed that Emily did not defend herself, did not argue, and did not attempt to embarrass Vanessa in return. She simply answered with quiet sincerity, "I am still learning." Those 4 words settled over the nearby group with surprising weight. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Damien remained perfectly still, but inside his thoughts had become far less orderly than his expression suggested. The uncomfortable silence lasted only a few seconds before Victor Moretti stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to shaping the future of powerful families. His silver hair, immaculate tuxedo, and measured smile projected refinement, yet every influential guest understood that his greatest strength had never been charm. It was influence. Conversations gradually quieted as he accepted a crystal glass from a passing server and lightly tapped it with a silver spoon. The clear note echoed across the ballroom, inviting every guest to turn toward the center stage. Damien remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Emily quietly stepped away from the gathering, assuming the announcement had nothing to do with her responsibilities. She reached for another stack of donation envelopes near the registration table, determined to focus on work instead of the strange tension lingering in the room. Victor smiled warmly at the audience. Thank you all for joining us this evening to support a wonderful cause. Before we continue with tonight's auction, I would like to recognize a partnership that represents not only two respected organizations, but also a shared vision for stability, prosperity, and the future. Applause spread politely throughout the ballroom. Emily looked up with mild curiosity while organizing the envelopes into perfectly even rows. She whispered to herself, "Hopefully this speech is shorter than last year's." One volunteer standing beside her smiled. "You came last year too?" Emily nodded proudly. "I accidentally glued two auction paddles together, but everyone was very forgiving." The volunteer laughed before returning her attention to the stage. Victor continued speaking with calm authority. For many years, the Romano and Moretti families have built mutual trust through cooperation and respect. Tonight, I believe that relationship deserves to enter a new chapter. Emily absent-mindedly reached for a glass of sparkling water without realizing it belonged to someone else. The elderly gentleman beside her gently cleared his throat. Emily looked down at the glass, froze, then handed it back with an embarrassed smile. "I almost adopted your drink. I am so sorry." The gentleman chuckled kindly. "It seems determined to follow you." Emily covered her face for a second, laughing at herself once again. The light-hearted moment disappeared almost instantly as Victor's next words carried across the ballroom. "It has always been my hope that my daughter, Vanessa, and Damian Romano would one day unite their futures." The applause that followed sounded louder than before. Emily's smile faded before she even realized it had disappeared. She slowly turned toward the stage. Vanessa accepted the attention with graceful confidence while standing beside her father. Several influential guests nodded approvingly, clearly viewing the announcement as a logical alliance between two powerful dynasties. Emily instinctively looked toward Damien. He had not moved. He had not smiled. He had not objected. The absence of any reaction somehow hurt more than if he had openly agreed. Emily lowered her eyes before anyone could notice the disappointment quietly settling inside her. She reminded herself that she was only his secretary. She managed his calendar, organized meetings, answered calls, and occasionally reminded him to eat lunch when work consumed his entire day. That was all. Whatever personal dreams she had secretly buried over the past 3 years had never belonged inside his world. She forced herself to inhale slowly. "Do not be ridiculous, Emily," she whispered inside her own mind. "You knew exactly who he was long before tonight." She smiled politely at the volunteer beside her and excused herself, claiming she wanted to check whether the silent auction tables needed more bid sheets. In reality, she simply needed a quiet place where no one would notice the unexpected sting behind her eyes. As she walked toward the terrace doors overlooking the city skyline, Damien's attention followed her without hesitation. Victor continued speaking. Vanessa accepted. Congratulations from nearby guests. Advisors quietly discussed the political value of such an alliance. Yet Damien heard none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the woman slipping out of the ballroom with careful composure, pretending everything was perfectly fine while unknowingly carrying away the only thing that had managed to distract him all evening. Cool evening air drifted across the terrace, carrying the distant sounds of traffic several stories below, while the celebration continued behind the tall glass doors. Emily rested both hands against the polished stone railing and closed her eyes for a moment, hoping the fresh breeze would calm the emotions she refused to acknowledge. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, each glowing window reminding her that millions of lives continued without caring whether one's secretary had suddenly realized she had been quietly hoping for something impossible. She laughed softly at herself, although there was little humor behind it. "Nice job, Emily," she whispered. "Fall for the least available man in New York. Very practical." She shook her head and smiled through the disappointment. Next time, maybe choose someone who owns a bookstore. A quiet voice answered from behind her. You're talking to yourself again. Emily turned so quickly that she almost lost her balance before recognizing Damien, standing only a few feet away. His jacket remained perfectly tailored despite the long evening, and the city lights reflected faintly across the dark ink winding along his neck. Emily immediately straightened her posture. I was just organizing my thoughts. Damien looked at her for several silent seconds. You looked upset. Emily attempted the same cheerful smile she had worn throughout the gala. I am fine. No. His answer came without hesitation. You are pretending to be fine. The words caught her completely off guard. For 3 years, Damien had noticed missed appointments, accounting errors, scheduling conflicts, and the smallest security concerns before anyone else. She had never imagined he would notice the difference between her real smile and the one she wore for everyone else's comfort. Emily looked away, toward the skyline. It has been a long evening. Damien stepped beside her, leaving enough distance to respect her space, while remaining close enough that she knew he had no intention of walking away until he understood the truth. Was Vanessa responsible? Emily hesitated. She could have answered yes. It would have been easier. Vanessa's comments had certainly hurt, but they were not the reason she had left the ballroom. She slowly shook her head. She was not the reason. Damien studied her profile. Then tell me what is. Emily took a slow breath, searching for words that would not reveal too much. Have you ever spent a long time convincing yourself that something could never happen? Damien answered quietly. Yes. She nodded. Then one day you accidentally forget that rule for a little while. Her voice grew softer, only for a little while, just enough to imagine a different ending. Damien remained completely still. Emily forced herself to continue before courage disappeared. Then reality reminds you where everyone belongs. She smiled sadly. That part is never anyone's fault. Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You believe you do not belong in that room. Emily laughed once, though it sounded fragile. No, I belong in the room. She looked down at her hands. I just do not belong in the story everyone else is writing. Silence settled between them again. The orchestra inside the ballroom began another elegant melody, but neither of them moved toward the doors. Damien found himself fighting a battle he had never expected. Every instinct shaped by years of leadership reminded him that alliances mattered. Emotions complicated judgment, and distance protected everyone under his responsibility. Yet another voice, one he barely recognized, questioned why watching Emily walk away had felt far worse than any difficult negotiation he had ever faced. Emily finally smiled again, this time with genuine warmth despite the sadness behind it. Do not worry, sir. Tomorrow morning I'll be back at my desk reminding you about meetings, correcting your calendar, and making sure you actually eat lunch. She laughed quietly. Everything will go back to normal. Damien looked directly into her eyes. For the first time in years, the future everyone expected from him no longer felt certain. And for the first time in her life, Emily wished she had never learned how to smile while her heart quietly broke. Damien held Emily's gaze as though the entire city beyond the terrace had disappeared. He wanted to say something that would erase the sadness he had seen in her eyes only moments earlier, but every sentence that formed inside his mind collided with decades of discipline before reaching his lips. He had spent his entire adult life separating emotion from responsibility because hesitation could cost innocent people their safety. Yet standing beside Emily, he found himself questioning rules that had never failed him before. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp electronic tone sounded inside Damien's jacket. It was not the ringtone reserved for ordinary business. It was the encrypted security channel that only his inner circle could access. Damien answered immediately, his expression changing with every passing second. Report, he said quietly. His chief of security responded in a controlled voice. Sir, our surveillance team just identified an unauthorized maintenance vehicle parked 2 blocks from the ballroom. The driver used false credentials. We also intercepted unusual radio traffic from an unknown source. We recommend moving all guests indoors while we verify the situation. Damien's eyes hardened. Lock down every entrance without creating panic. Keep the guests calm. I am on my way. He ended the call and immediately looked toward Emily. She noticed a change before he spoke. Something is wrong, is not it? She asked softly. Damien nodded once. There may be a security concern. Stay close to me. Emily swallowed, but managed a small smile. I was hoping the rest of tonight might finally become normal. She sighed dramatically. Apparently, the universe disagrees. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Damien almost smiled. You still find a way to joke. Emily shrugged nervously. If I stop joking, I will probably start worrying. They stepped back inside the ballroom together. Nothing appeared unusual to the guests. The orchestra continued playing. Waiters carried elegant trays between tables. Wealthy donors admired auction items, while photographers captured polished smiles. Yet Damien immediately noticed details invisible to everyone else. Two security officers had quietly changed positions near the west entrance. Another discreetly guided several employees away from the loading corridor. His organization moved with practiced precision, making every adjustment appear effortless. Emily followed Damien while trying not to interfere. She accidentally walked in front of one photographer, realized it immediately, ducked awkwardly beneath the camera lens, apologized twice, then hurried back beside Damien. I really should receive professional training on how to exist without being in someone's way, she whispered. Damien glanced at her. You are not in the way. Before Emily could answer, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the ballroom. Several guests gasped as a towering floral arrangement tipped sideways after an employee stumbled over a decorative stand. Crystal vases shattered against the floor, sending flowers and water across the polished marble. For one heartbeat, the room froze. Damien instinctively stepped in front of Emily while his security team rapidly secured the surrounding area. The startled employee immediately raised both hands, apologizing repeatedly as other staff members rushed to help. Within seconds, Damien's chief of security quietly confirmed through his earpiece that the disturbance had been an accident, not a deliberate threat. The tension eased, but only slightly. Emily looked around at the anxious faces before noticing a little girl standing near one of the banquet tables, clutching a stuffed rabbit and fighting back tears after being frightened by the noise. Without thinking, Emily gently excused herself and walked toward the child. She crouched carefully, so they were at the same eye level, and smiled. That was a very dramatic flower arrangement, she whispered. I think I wanted everyone to admire it one last time. The little girl blinked before letting out a tiny laugh. Emily picked up one unbroken white rose that had rolled across the floor and offered it to her. Would you help me rescue this brave flower? The child nodded happily and accepted the rose with both hands. Watching from several feet away, Damien felt something shift inside him once again. In the middle of uncertainty, while powerful people focused on protecting reputations and preserving order, Emily had noticed the only frightened child in the room. She had not hesitated. She had simply chosen kindness. And for reasons he could no longer deny, Damien realized that protecting Emily had quietly become just as important to him as protecting everyone else under his care. The frightened little girl hugged the white rose against her chest and smiled up at Emily, as though the entire ballroom had become a safer place. Her parents thanked Emily repeatedly before leading their daughter back toward the banquet tables. Emily waved goodbye with an awkward little grin, then accidentally realized she was still crouching in the middle of the walkway. Right, she whispered to herself. Standing would probably help. She pushed herself upright, brushed an invisible speck of dust from her dress, and nearly walked into Damien once again. She stopped just inches away, looking up with an embarrassed laugh. I promise I am not following you on purpose. I know, Damien answered quietly. Before either of them could continue, his chief of security approached with careful urgency. Sir, may I have a word? Damien nodded and stepped several feet aside, though his eyes never drifted far from Emily. His advisor lowered his voice. The maintenance vehicle was abandoned before our team arrived. The driver disappeared. We searched the cargo compartment and found nothing dangerous, but there was one unusual item. He handed Damien a sealed evidence pouch containing a plain black flash drive. No fingerprints, no markings. Security footage shows one hotel employee carrying it through the service entrance 20 minutes ago. Damien examined the pouch without opening it. Identify the employee. That is the strange part. We cannot. Every camera that should have recorded the hallway went offline for exactly 90 seconds. Damien's expression hardened. Someone planned this. His advisor nodded. There is more. We recovered partial audio from one intercepted radio transmission. He hesitated before continuing. The message was incomplete, but one sentence was clear. They said she still has it. Damien slowly looked across the ballroom toward Emily. She was helping an elderly guest adjust an auction paddle that had become stuck inside the chair cushion. The older gentleman laughed as Emily carefully tugged the paddle free with both hands before raising it triumphantly like she had just won a championship. Several nearby guests applauded jokingly, and Emily gave an exaggerated bow that made everyone laugh again. She looked completely unaware that anything unusual was unfolding around her. Damien frowned. Who is she? His advisor shook his head. We do not know. At that exact moment, Emily reached into the small evening bag hanging from her shoulder, searching for a pen to help another donor complete a pledge card. Instead of finding the pen immediately, she accidentally pulled out a folded grocery list, 2 colorful hair ties, a tiny flashlight, a pack of peppermint candies, and a bright yellow rubber duck keychain. She stared at the unexpected collection in her hand before laughing at herself. I really need to organize this bag. Several donors smiled warmly as she quickly gathered everything together again. Finally, she located the missing pen. Found it, she announced with obvious satisfaction. Damien watched the scene closely until one tiny detail caught his attention. Mixed among Emily's ordinary belongings had been a second flash drive, almost identical to the one now sealed inside the evidence pouch. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, a habit formed by years of facing difficult decisions. Bring me a photograph of the recovered drive, he ordered. Within seconds, his advisor displayed a secure image on a tablet. Damien compared it with a brief glimpse he had seen inside Emily's purse. The shape, the color, even the small silver ring attached to the end appeared almost identical. Emily finally finished assisting the donor and tucked the pen back in her bag. Without noticing Damien's thoughtful expression, she smiled innocently as she walked toward him. Good news, she said proudly. I only dropped one pledge card this time. Damien looked at her shoulder bag for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again. She had absolutely no idea that she might be carrying something far more important than office supplies and peppermint candies. And somewhere beyond the glittering ballroom, someone else seemed to believe she still had exactly what they were searching for. Emily smiled as she reached Damien, completely unaware that his attention was no longer focused on the charity gala, but on the small shoulder bag she carried so casually. Did I miss anything important? She asked. Damien answered without taking his eyes off her. Possibly. Emily immediately looked around the ballroom. Did another flower arrangement declare independence? Damien almost smiled before quietly saying, May I see your bag? Emily blinked once. My bag. She laughed nervously. I should warn you that it contains absolutely no organization whatsoever. Without hesitation, she handed it to him. Trust came naturally to her, something Damien admired and feared at the same time. He carefully opened the small bag while Emily stood beside him, genuinely curious about what he was looking for. Please do not judge me, she said softly. I always think I know where everything is until I actually need it. Damien ignored the colorful hair ties, the grocery list, the peppermints, the tiny flashlight, and the yellow rubber duck keychain. Instead, he reached toward the compact side pocket where a black flash drive rested beside a spare charging cable. Emily looked surprised. Oh, I forgot that was in there. Damien slowly held it between his fingers. It matched the recovered device almost perfectly. Where did you get this? Emily frowned, trying to remember. I honestly do not know. She folded her arms while thinking. Wait, yes, I remember now. Damien remained silent. Yesterday afternoon, someone asked me to deliver an envelope to your office because you were still in meeting. She looked embarrassed. I accidentally dropped the envelope in the hallway. She laughed awkwardly. Everything fell onto the floor. Papers, sticky notes, pens, and this little thing. She pointed toward the flash drive. I assumed it belonged to the envelope, so I picked everything up and placed it inside my bag. Then your afternoon schedule became completely chaotic, and her eyes widened. I never put it back. Damien exchanged a quick glance with his chief of security. The missing piece suddenly fit together far too well. Emily had not stolen anything. She had simply made one of her ordinary, innocent mistakes. Unfortunately, this particular mistake might have placed her in the center of someone else's carefully prepared plan. His advisor quietly stepped closer. "Sir, that explains the intercepted message." Damien nodded almost imperceptibly. Emily looked from one serious face to another. "Can someone please tell me why everyone suddenly looks like I accidentally adopted classified information?" No one answered immediately. Emily's cheerful expression slowly disappeared. "Did I do something wrong?" Damien shook his head. "No." "Then why are you all looking at me like that?" He carefully returned the flash drive to the evidence pouch instead of placing it back inside her bag. "Because whoever lost this may believe you still have it." Emily stared at him in confusion before quietly replying, "But I never even knew it was important." "Neither did they," Damien answered. "That is what concerns me." Before Emily could ask another question, one of the security officers approached at a brisk but controlled pace. "Sir," he said quietly, "the surveillance team just located the individual who entered through the service corridor earlier tonight." Damien's eyes sharpened. "Where?" "He left the hotel 6 minutes ago, but another development requires immediate attention." The officer lowered his voice further. "A black sport utility vehicle has been circling the block 3 times. It slows each time it passes the east entrance before driving away again." Emily instinctively glanced toward the tall windows overlooking the street. She could only see reflections from the ballroom lights against the glass. "Maybe they're just looking for parking," she suggested hopefully. The security officer politely remained silent. Damien gently took Emily's evening bag and handed it to one of his advisors instead. "From this moment forward," he said calmly, "you do not leave my sight." Emily searched his face, finally understanding that this was no longer about an awkward evening at a charity gala or an embarrassing misunderstanding. Somewhere outside the warmth of the ballroom, invisible eyes had begun searching for a person who never intended to become part of anyone else's dangerous game. And for the first time that night, even Emily could no longer laugh away the feeling that something was quietly closing in around her. Damien did not waste another second. Years of leading an organization built on preparation had taught him that uncertainty became more dangerous every minute it remained unanswered. He turned toward his chief of security with the calm authority that had guided countless difficult situations. "Move every guest to the ballroom's interior without causing alarm. Double the personnel at every entrance. No one leaves until we know exactly what we are dealing with." The instructions spread through discreet earpieces almost instantly. Around the ballroom, security personnel adjusted their positions with such natural precision that most guests assumed they were simply continuing their routine assignments. Emily stood beside Damien, trying to remain calm even though her thoughts were racing faster than ever before. "I'm really sorry," she whispered. "If I had remembered the flash drive yesterday, none of this would be happening." Damien looked directly at her. "Do not blame yourself for someone else's decisions." Emily lowered her eyes. "That does not make me feel much better." Before Damien could answer, Victor Moretti approached with Vanessa at his side, both wearing polite smiles that barely concealed their curiosity. Victor glanced toward the additional security near the entrances. "Something seems to have changed." Damien answered evenly. "A routine precaution." Victor nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced. Vanessa shifted her attention toward Emily, noticing the concern on her face. "You certainly know how to attract excitement," she said smoothly. Emily attempted a courteous smile. "I promised this was not on my schedule." Vanessa folded her arms. It never is with people who create problems without realizing it. Emily looked down for a brief moment before replying quietly. I never wanted to inconvenience anyone. Vanessa's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Intentions rarely matter. Results do. Damien stepped forward just enough to interrupt the exchange without raising his voice. That is enough. Vanessa turned toward him, surprised by the firmness in his tone. I was only stating a fact. No, Damien replied calmly. You were assigning blame before knowing the truth. An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Even Victor studied Damien more carefully than before. Emily quickly tried to ease the tension. Actually, she's right about one thing. Everyone looked at her. Emily smiled awkwardly. I do seem to collect unusual situations. She gave a tiny shrug. Last month, I accidentally locked myself inside the supply closet for 40 minutes because I pushed instead of pulled. One of Damien's senior advisors unexpectedly laughed before covering his mouth. Even Victor's serious expression softened for the briefest moment. Vanessa, however, remained unmoved. You always find a joke. Emily nodded honestly. It helps me think. Damien realized that even under growing pressure, Emily refused to surrender the gentle optimism that made her different from everyone else around him. His admiration deepened despite every logical reason it should not. At that moment, another security officer approached quickly, carrying a tablet displaying live camera feeds from outside the hotel. Sir, we have visual confirmation. The same sport utility vehicle has returned. Damien examined the screen. The dark vehicle slowed, once again near the east entrance, before continuing down the avenue. A second camera captured another sedan parked across the street, with tinted windows and no visible occupants. Maintain observation, Damien ordered. Do not engage unless necessary. I want information before conclusions. The officer nodded and disappeared back into the coordinated operation. Emily quietly leaned closer. Do you think they are watching the building? Damien answered truthfully. Yes. She swallowed. Do you think they are watching me? Damien held her gaze without hesitation. Until I know otherwise, I will assume they are. Emily wrapped her arms around herself. Not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming realization that an ordinary mistake had carried her into a world she had never imagined entering. Yet even then she forced herself to smile, though this one was much smaller than before. Well, she said softly, I suppose this officially beats spilling coffee as the most memorable thing that has happened to me this week. Damien almost smiled again, but beneath that fleeting expression, one quiet promise had already formed in his mind. Whatever secret surrounded the mysterious flash drive, whatever powerful people were searching for it, they would not reach Emily without first going through him. The atmosphere inside the ballroom remained elegant on the surface. Yet beneath the polished conversations, every member of Damien's security team had shifted into quiet readiness. Guests continued placing bids on charity items, musicians continued performing, and waiters continued serving refreshments, but the invisible rhythm of the evening had changed completely. Emily noticed it even without understanding the silent signals passing between security officers. People who had once appeared relaxed were now carefully observing every entrance, every hallway, and every unfamiliar face. She leaned slightly toward Damien and whispered, Everyone suddenly looks like they're solving the world's most complicated puzzle. Damien answered without looking away from the room. In a way, they are. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I wish I were better at puzzles. She smiled faintly. The last one I bought said it was 1,000 pieces. I accidentally discovered it was missing 12. I still finished it because I refused to let cardboard defeat me. Damien looked at her for a brief moment. Somehow she could still find ordinary stories in extraordinary circumstances. Before he could respond, his chief of security returned carrying a secure tablet and quietly spoke. Sir, we completed a preliminary scan of the recovered flash drive. Damien accepted the device. What did you find? It is encrypted with military-grade protection. We cannot access the contents yet, but we identified one important detail. He enlarged a digital image on the screen. The serial number matches equipment issued to an independent financial investigation task force nearly 2 years ago. Damien's expression remained calm, but his thoughts accelerated, which means someone wanted this information hidden. The advisor nodded, or someone wanted it delivered. Emily listened carefully before raising one hesitant hand as though she were sitting in a classroom. "May I ask a very possibly foolish question?" Damien looked at her. "Go ahead." She pointed toward the tablet. "If someone wanted that flash drive back so badly, why leave another one inside the maintenance vehicle?" The advisor paused. Damien slowly turned toward him. Emily continued, speaking more to herself than anyone else. "That seems strange. If I lose my house keys, I do not leave another set inside my car, hoping someone becomes confused." She frowned. "Actually, I did lose my house keys once, but that is a completely different story." Silence followed. Damien's chief of security looked back at the two evidence photographs displayed side by side. After several long seconds, his eyes widened slightly. "Sir," Damien already understood. The drive recovered from the vehicle was never meant to be recovered. The advisor nodded. "It is a decoy." Emily blinked. "A decoy," Damien explained quietly. "Someone expected us to find it and focus on the wrong device, while the real one remained somewhere else." Emily slowly looked toward the evidence pouch resting beside Damien. Then she looked at her own handbag, now held by one of the advisors. "You mean?" "Yes," Damien replied. "The one you accidentally carried may be the genuine drive." Emily's face turned pale. "I cannot believe my organizational skills almost started an international mystery." Even Damien's chief of security allowed himself the smallest smile. "Miss Carter, I have worked in executive protection for 22 years. I have never seen a situation unfold quite like this." Emily sighed dramatically. "That somehow does not make me feel better." At that exact moment, a phone vibrated inside Victor Moretti's jacket. He stepped several feet away to answer, keeping his voice low, but Damien noticed something unusual. Victor's composed expression disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning to normal. When the call ended, Victor looked across the ballroom, not toward Damien, but directly toward Emily. The glance lasted barely an instant, yet Damien caught it. So did Vanessa. Her eyes narrowed with growing suspicion as she followed her father's line of sight. Emily, completely unaware, had become distracted by the dessert table after noticing tiny lemon pastries arranged in perfect rows. She quietly whispered to herself, "Those are almost too pretty to eat." Damien watched her smile at something so wonderfully ordinary while invisible currents of deception moved through the ballroom around her. In that moment, he reached a decision that surprised even himself. This was no longer simply about recovering a mysterious flash drive or protecting an important investigation. Somewhere between spilled coffee, scattered brochures, awkward jokes, and quiet acts of kindness, Emily Carter had become the one person he could no longer allow the darkness surrounding his world to reach. Damien quietly asked his chief of security to escort Emily to a private conference room adjoining the ballroom, while the technical team examined the authentic flash drive inside a secure offline environment. Emily followed without protest, although she glanced longingly toward the dessert table one last time. "Please tell me those little lemon pastries will still be there later," she said hopefully. Damien almost smiled. "I will make sure they are." Emily nodded with complete sincerity. "Thank you." That suddenly became my biggest motivation to survive this very confusing evening. Even under growing pressure, she somehow found a way to make the people around her breathe a little easier. Minutes later, the conference room filled with quiet concentration as encrypted files slowly appeared on a protected monitor. Damien, his advisor, and two cybersecurity specialists studied the recovered information while Emily sat patiently in a nearby chair holding a cup of hot tea she had not touched. She tried not to interrupt, but curiosity eventually won. "Is it good news or terrible news?" One of the specialists answered honestly. "Both." Damien turned his attention toward the screen where hundreds of financial records, shell companies, and hidden transfers connected names that should never have appeared together. Some belonged to respected executives. Others belonged to criminal brokers already under investigation. Yet one name immediately drew every eye in the room. Victor Moretti. Emily looked from one serious face to another. That seems important. Damien nodded slowly. More important than I expected. The evidence suggested years of carefully concealed financial manipulation involving multiple organizations. The decoy flash drive had been created to mislead anyone searching for the truth, while the authentic device contained records capable of exposing an entire network operating beneath legitimate businesses. Damien finally understood why unknown observers had followed the gala so closely. They were never searching randomly. They believed the real evidence had disappeared into Emily's possession by accident. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Vanessa stepped into the room after receiving permission, her confident expression replaced by something far less certain. She looked first at Damien, then at the monitor displaying her father's name. I knew he was hiding something, she admitted quietly. I did not know it was this. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Vanessa slowly removed a small envelope from her evening purse and placed it on the conference table. 3 months ago, I found these documents in my father's study. I confronted him. He told me to forget I had ever seen them. She looked directly at Damien. I could not. Damien opened the envelope and discovered handwritten notes matching several account numbers already displayed on the screen. The evidence fit together perfectly. Emily watched Vanessa carefully before speaking with surprising gentleness. You loved your father. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. I still do. Emily nodded with quiet understanding. That probably makes this much harder. Vanessa looked at her in genuine surprise. She had expected judgment. She had expected satisfaction. Instead, she found compassion. After everything I said to you tonight, Vanessa began. Emily interrupted with a small smile. People sometimes say unkind things when they are afraid of losing something important. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I was afraid. Emily answered softly. I know. The room fell silent once more. Damien observed the exchange with thoughtful disbelief. Emily had every reason to resent Vanessa, yet she chose empathy instead. That choice changed something inside the room more effectively than any speech could have done. Vanessa took a slow breath before looking back at Damien. I will cooperate completely. Whatever investigators need, I will provide it. Damien nodded once. That is the right decision. Vanessa turned toward Emily before leaving. I misjudged you. Emily smiled awkwardly. It happens more often than you would think. Sometimes I even misjudge myself. A quiet laugh escaped Vanessa despite everything that had happened. As the door closed behind her, Damien looked at Emily with new clarity. Strength was not always measured by power, influence, or fear. Sometimes it appeared as simple kindness offered to someone who no longer believed they deserved it. And in that quiet conference room, surrounded by evidence capable of changing powerful lives, Damien realized that Emily had transformed far more than the outcome of a single investigation. She had begun changing him. The following Monday morning, the Romano headquarters looked exactly as it always had. Assistants hurried through the hallways, carrying schedules. Conference rooms filled with quiet conversations. Security teams exchanged brief reports before disappearing toward their assigned positions. To everyone else, it seemed like another ordinary beginning to a busy week. Only a handful of people knew how much had changed over the past few days. The investigation had been transferred to the proper authorities, the evidence had been secured through official channels, and several influential figures had quietly resigned before public announcements could be made. Victor Moretti had stepped away from every leadership position connected to his business empire while the investigation continued. Vanessa had chosen to cooperate completely, accepting responsibility for helping reveal the truth instead of protecting appearances. The city moved forward, but nothing inside Damien Romano felt quite the same. He stood inside his office reviewing the morning calendar when he heard a familiar knock. Come in, he said. The door opened, and Emily Carter carefully stepped inside, carrying a thick folder, a tablet, 2 cups of coffee, and what appeared to be a small paper bag from the bakery across the street. She smiled brightly. Good morning. I successfully arrived without spilling either coffee. She paused for one thoughtful second. Actually, I almost spilled one in the elevator, but I recovered beautifully. Damien looked at her for a long moment before quietly smiling. It was not the polite smile executives displayed during negotiations. It was genuine. Emily noticed immediately and looked pleasantly surprised. "You are smiling." Damien nodded once. "Apparently I am." Emily laughed. "That feels important somehow." She placed everything neatly on his desk before pulling the folded schedule from the folder. "You have 3 meetings this morning, one lunch that you are absolutely not allowed to skip, and your accountant specifically asked me to remind you that ignoring emails is apparently not a long-term financial strategy." Damien accepted the schedule, but never looked away from her. "Emily, yes. There is one change." She immediately reached for her pen. "Of course. Which meeting would you like to move?" "None of them." She looked up confused. "Then what changed?" Damien walked around the desk until he stood beside her instead of across from her. For years, he had hidden behind distance because it felt safer. Today, he chose honesty instead. "You asked me something without realizing it the night of the gala." Emily searched her memory. "I asked many things that night. You said everything would return to normal." Emily nodded slowly. "I remember." Damien gently shook his head. "I did not want normal anymore." She blinked, completely caught off guard. "You do not?" "No." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried quiet certainty. "I spent years believing responsibility meant never allowing anyone to become important enough to change my decisions. Then someone walked into my office every morning carrying coffee, reminding me to eat lunch, making impossible schedules somehow work, laughing at her own mistakes, and treating every person with kindness whether they deserved it or not." Emily's eyes slowly filled with emotion. Damien continued. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped looking forward to successful meetings." He smiled softly. "I started looking forward to hearing your voice." Emily stood perfectly still for several seconds before laughing through happy tears. "I knew the coffee was memorable." Damien laughed quietly for the first time in years. "It was never the coffee." Emily looked down, suddenly shy. "I should probably tell you something too." "Go ahead." She smiled with the same innocent honesty that had first captured his attention. "I have liked you for much longer than was professionally convenient." Damien gently reached for her hand. "Then perhaps we should create better professional policies." Emily laughed again before remembering something. "Wait." She opened a small bakery bag and proudly placed 2 tiny lemon pastries on his desk. "I promised myself I would come back for these after everything settled down." Damien looked at the pastries, then back at Emily. "You remembered." "Of course." She grinned. Some goals are simply too important to abandon. They shared the pastries while reviewing the morning schedule together. And for the first time, the office felt less like the headquarters of a powerful empire and more like a place where 2 ordinary people could quietly enjoy an ordinary moment. Outside the windows, New York continued rushing through another busy day, unaware that one forgotten flash drive, one awkward secretary, and one unexpected question had changed. 2 lives forever. And on that ordinary Monday morning, Damien Romano finally understood that real strength was never measured by power alone. Sometimes it began with choosing kindness, protecting dignity, and having the courage to let someone unexpected become your home.